Hi, my name's Austin Blau. I'm the music composer for Rodent Retribution, and we're going to go over the combat music, how it was written, and then how it's implemented. More so how it's implemented than anything. The way that I wrote all these pieces was in different variations. Some were written as a whole piece altogether, and then some were just written as individual chunks. But eventually they came into becoming different chunks here. Like, I'll give you a little taste for a second. My computer's lagging a little bit, but you get the idea. So these are all mixed and mastered. There's multiple tracks in here, nothing too crazy. Just a bunch of different guitars, bass, synths that are all mixed and mastered the same way. But there's tons of variations in here. There's things like riff 1 main. There's the double time version of the same riff. There's even the staccato version. Alternative versions, lead versions, the intro, the outro, like the outro. And there's two other riffs that have the same variations as well. Plus a bunch of other stuff that I just ended up not using, even like some testing I did between some of the different chunks. But the idea here is just to have a wide net of variations that I can choose from. I've tested before doing some metal tracks where you have the different layers exported and thrown into Wise, like just the guitars or just the drums. And then you have variations within that, which will save you a little bit more relatively in your performance sometimes, depending on how you break it up. But I found that it's harder to get the mix and master that I'm looking for inside of Wise if I have multiple layers. So it's easier for me to have the mixed and mastered how I would normally do it, and then I export fully mastered chunks, essentially. I have 3 different riffs, multiple different variations within the riffs, and those are individually exported to bring into Wise to be able to mess with and set up a whole system for. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, so this is Wise, and this might take a little while just to preface, but this is the playlist container for the music system. If you've not worked in Wise before, it might look like a lot of gibberish. If you've worked in Wise, it might still look kind of gibberish-y. I mean, you'll understand what's going on here, but there's a decent amount. It's probably not the most complicated playlist container of all time, but there's a decent amount of choices being made in here. Like, all of this in here is very meticulous. So I guess the best way to start would be to play it real quick and just show you what it sounds like. Okay, that is essentially one run through of how this works. It's not the whole thing, obviously, but I've broken it down into kind of the same setup repeated 3 times. So it ends here, right, for the first section. This is all one section, and then it's essentially copy and pasted in its own way twice. You just have, since you have these 3 riffs in here, right, you have yellow, blue, and red, 1, 2, and 3. And then you have the risers short, which I'll explain in a second. I broke it down into these 3 sections where you have your intro that always plays, and the intro always goes into the main section, right, of the riff. I had to make a variation on it, but it's essentially doing that. That way you're not having an intro that then leads into a completely different riff, because that might feel a little weird. So it always goes into the riff that is playing in the intro. After that, it then goes to a random step. So it's randomly selecting between riff 2 main and riff 3 main. And so you have an avoid repeat in here, so you're not going to be repeating the same thing by the time it gets back to the top. And I do have a little bit of weight added to some of these choices so that it's deciding to choose riff 2 main over riff 3. The reason for that is mainly the way that I wrote them. Riff 1 and riff 3 are relatively similar. They use more similar parts, and riff 2 is a lot different. So I'd rather it choose riff 2 first if it's doing, riff 1 and then like something different and then riff 3. But I don't want it to happen every time. I'd rather that when it comes back around after doing all of this, it will then choose something different because it's avoiding the repeat. Might be a little bit much, but after that it goes to this riff 1 alternative, which I use for all of them, but it ended up working, which is just a slight change of rhythm, which is helpful. And then it jumps into the new box that I've created, essentially. The things in between all these are the risers short/high. It's this thing here. Changes every time. Essentially, it is a riser and a hit in there, and like an impact shatter, even like a kick drum too, to help emphasize things. It changes each time you select it, but the big part about it is that the entry cue and the exit cue are on the exact same point. So essentially what that means is if we go back to the playlist container, once riff 1 intro hits its exit cue, we're already using a little bit of this space at the end here for the beginning of that riser. And then the exit cue means that you're not playing the riser next. It's just the intro, then this little riser thing, and then intro main at its entry cue. It might be a little bit complicated, but essentially the point is in between intro and intro main, or intro main and riff 2 main, you have a riser that builds up to that connecting point between those two, and then the hit hits on that moment. It doesn't take the place of the next thing that it's transitioning into. The reason that that's important, at least for me, is it makes it easier for things to transition into each other without having to put in different risers and hits and swooshes and impacts and everything built into those riffs themselves. I just have this other system where I can load up a bunch of different ones that I like that work for all of this, and it helps for the transition between different parts. It's just what's worked well for me, so I've been using that for a little while. It's a fun little thing where you're using the intro or the entry cue and the exit cue at the same time for this. So you'll see that throughout the whole playlist container, obviously. Obviously, then once you get to these other sections, you're starting with riff 2 intro, which means that now this section won't have riff 2 main, it's going to have riff 1 main. And I'm weighing it differently again based on the similarities between the riffs as well. And so that's essentially this whole thing in here. Obviously, you have all the different pieces. There's a couple different things I did. So for instance, intro main includes riff 1 main, but also riff 1 staccato, which is why I said they would come in handy, because it felt a little too boring, like it was staying the same every time it was repeating, just like the regular main part. And so the staccato actually came in handy to help out with making things feel a little bit more dynamic. Like this is kind of how it transitions. Like you get this variation in there, which is really, really helpful. And so that essentially just plays in this whole collection in here. There's a lot of different groups and a lot of different ways that they work, but essentially it just flows down in this direction and then jumps to the next one and the next one, and it goes back up. There's also the outros, which are built into the transition area of the music switch container. So there's a bunch of different things in here, like the double time and leads became its own thing. It's its own section that plays on its own. That's used for parameters. So like if you, right now we have it set up for kill streak. So if you've killed like, let's say 10 rats without getting shot or without dying, then we play the double time section and it transitions into that properly. So I needed to set up these different transitions for that. Beyond that, we have different things in here, like if high intensity or medium intensity, let me actually see what I'm looking for. If high intensity goes to, yes, okay. Honestly, some of this can be a little confusing even for me to look at sometimes, but if high intensity, which is what we were looking at, the high intensity combat, if that goes into anything, so anything besides what we're setting up in this transitions area, which would be usually like, ambience or shop music or anything like that, it will wait for the next bar to exit out of that and play the Combat 1 transition segment, which is a stinger I have in here, which sounds like this. And then same thing, there's a transition in the music switch container for death too. And so there's also a death setting. But that's really anywhere in the game. But that's essentially it. There's also the medium intensity segment, but that's some other stuff I've like messed around with and tried out, and it's something we use in the game as well because there's medium intensity combat too. It's a little bit less interesting, so I don't think it necessarily needs its own video unless people really think it does. But at least for now, the high intensity is more a more complicated setup. But it works really well. At the end of the day, it just sounds like something that was written. I mean, I could have done all of this in the DAW essentially in its own way, just like written out something that was 15 minutes long, or I could just do a screen recording of this, chop that up, and then just put that in as one loopable segment. And it relatively does the same thing, but I like the way this was set up. This allowed me to really play around with how this system works and how I can make it work for the game and make it feel natural. And that's kind of the idea at the end of the day is when I press play, it seems weird because there's all this weird stuff in here, but it just sounds like a song that's playing. And that's the whole point. Yeah, if you decide to watch this whole thing, thanks for sticking around for this. This is a lot, but I love designing systems like this. They're really, really fun. And they could really benefit the game, especially when you tie in different parameters in here, like the double bass section, which plays when you select the double time setting or the lead setting. And so then it changes all this up. It's really, really fun. And I can go into that in more depth in a different video, but I thought this would be helpful to show how the combat works. So yeah, thanks. Later.